All right, man. What's up, my peoples? What's up, my brother Tank?
What's going on, brother? What's
Oh
going on,
man,
chat? What's going on, everybody listening on the replay? Everybody, make sure I hit that like button before we start.
yes indeed, yes indeed. Make sure you hit that like button, man. But we're gonna get ready to get into chapter number 7 of Black Labor, White Wealth. All right. So
What's
without
going
further
on, brother?
ado, here we go. A national public policy on Black people. Take up the white man's burdens. 100 times made plain to seek another profit and work another gain. The totality of Black people's existence and conditions in America stem directly from a national public plan designed by white society to control and use Black labor to build a new nation. The public policy on the use of blacks developed incrementally until it became like an onion with many layers. It began taking shape in 1619 and evolving into a systematic, mandated social arrangement that dictated the behavior of both blacks and whites. The policy core principles stipulated that blacks were to be used as a well disciplined, uncompensated, subordinated, non competitive, permanent labor class that existed on the margins of society. The national public policy determined Black people's human worth and status, as well as their educational and political opportunities and their cultural and family values. The dominant white society's national public policy explicitly and implicitly defined how Blacks were to be treated and used. Public policy is important for Blacks to study because it gives clear insight into the process and methods that the dominant society used to establish absolute control over millions of Blacks as a laboring class. But equally important, it shows Blacks who are seeking to gain power through community organizing the way whites constructed a national Black policy and plan. Understanding the plan is essential to the shaping of a new public policy for Blacks. The public policy was formulated from racial dogmas and doctrines that justify the policy. The doctrines of racial superiority legitimize the exclusion and segregation of Blacks from mainstream white society. The doctrine and non interferences dissuaded governments and social institutions from using their resources and powers to stop the abuse of Black people. And the doctrine and expendability promoted the belief that Black life was non sacred and that there was nothing wrong with using Blacks for the betterment and protection of white life. These policies, doctrines, and dogmas continue to determine the quality of life for whites and Blacks in America today. Next section: how the national plan on Blacks developed. European culture set the stage for the exploitative use of Black Africans and the social and physical conditions of life in the New World drove the English to construct an aggressive strategy to enslave them. No single factor compelled Europeans to seek out Blacks to serve as the labor class of the New World. Many factors converged simultaneously. The English people, like most Europeans, harbored racist attitudes towards Black people long before the first settlers arrived on the North American continent. The European traders and explorers to Africa had brought back stories about the Dark Continent and its dark-skinned heathens. The 17th century Anglo-Saxon culture was filled with anti-Black terms, and the first English settlers brought their prejudice with them to America. The first 20 Blacks entered Jamestown in 1619 on a Dutch warship. Whether or not these Blacks were slaves is a matter of interpretation because the records from that period are scant. but it is reasonable to assume that they were not considered slaves initially. They had been rescued from a Portuguese slave trading vessel by the Dutch warship. They were brought to Jamestown, and the Dutch captain exchanged them for food and ship supplies. If the Dutch captain indebted the blacks in the exchange, it was probably as indentured servants because records reveal that within 5 years, these blacks were free to buy land, carry weapons, go to court, and attend church, and generally socialize with others until the late 1630s. The cycle of black degeneration in American colonies was well underway by the late 1630s. Labor was critical. No one was available to do the backbreaking work, not even the free blacks. Word of the terrible work conditions had gotten back to Europe, and whites refused to come to America as indentured servants. Colonial courts and legislative assemblies had begun to enact punitive legislation or rulings against blacks or any white who consorted with them. As discussed earlier, the Maryland colonies set the stage for black slavery in America by issuing a government policy that singled blacks out for subordinate and exclusionary treatment based upon available records. Scattered incidences of Indians, whites, and black slavery was appearing in the Maryland colony as early as 1634. But 4 years later, in 1638, first public edicts or policy, or I can't pronounce that word, edicts or policies against blacks was issued by the Maryland Colonial Assembly. That edicts declared, and I'm pronouncing that word wrong,
No,
Edict.
it's edict. You got it right, brother. That's why I didn't say
Okay.
that. It's
Okay,
edict.
that
Yeah.
edict declared that neither the original 20 free blacks nor their offspring shall be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society. This Maryland edict became the founding public policy for the use and treatment of blacks, from which white racism, Jim Crowism, and segregation later grew.
The next section. The next section is a broad community need shapes the public policy. An abundance of free land and shortage of labor made involuntary labor the key to white survival. Those who owned the largest tracts of undeveloped land could not convert the huge tracts into productive, profitable agricultural businesses without the assistance of a disciplined, strong, expendable, and preferably unpaid workforce. Without such a workforce, it was questionable whether the colonies could survive, let alone prosper. Neither Indians nor white indentured servants would do the laborious work. A bound labor force was the logical solution. The Maryland Public Edict on blacks took on greater importance as the colonial settlers realized that they had possibly had the key to their common labor problem in the use of black people as their uncompensated workers. The labor problem was resolved in the year 1665 when all of the existing colonies enacted laws to enslave blacks. The Maryland colony's original edict was expanded into a public policy on blacks, stipulating that, quote, black people shall constitute an available, uncompensated, non competitive, well disciplined, permanently subordinated workforce, which shall be separated from the white society, end quote. England supported the colony's enactment of slavery laws by establishing a full scale international slave trading industry to provide them with a dependable supply of black slaves. The primary purpose of forced black labor was to bring whites' newly acquired land to productivity and value by clearing the forest, building the houses, raising the crops, tending the livestock, preparing the food, and raising and comforting the white families. Second, the slaves were to supply England's industries with valuable cash crops and commodities. After the 1660s, all of the colonies had written black enslavement into their statutes. England, as the mother country and the overseer of the colonies, was the first to codify the colony's public policy on black slavery into an act passed in the year 1667 called the Act to Regulate the Negroes on British Plantations. Besides regulating the slave trading industry, this act introduced the concept of blacks as personal property and advocated strict and severe treatment of slaves. A doctrine of black expendability was explicitly advocated in this act, which granted white society the right to brand, whip, or actually kill enslaved blacks. 4 years later, in the year 1671, another Maryland Act strengthened the public policy by enacting the doctrine on non interference. This doctrine notified religious organizations that religious conversions and baptisms of slaves before or after importation to North America did not entitle the slaves to freedom as some slaves had hoped. This non interference doctrine was later expanded under the concept of quote unquote personal property rights, which soothed the fears of slave owners who were concerned about losing their investment in any slaves who converted to Christianity. The colonies devoted the next 20 years to perfecting a public policy that defined with mathematical precision what individuals, races, or ethnic groups would be slaves and how they were to be treated. By the year 1705, Virginia produced a codification of laws applying to slaves called, quote unquote, the slave codes, which standardized the public policy on blacks as well as white behavior towards blacks. The codes imbued the public policy on blacks with a new kind of social arrangement of accountability within the white community. It not only established rules of conduct with specified penalties for slaves, but it also implied a code of conduct for all white persons in their relations with blacks. It prohibited any white person from committing any act that elevated the status of blacks or demonstrated leniency in the treatment of slaves. The slave codes were premised in the belief that humility and weakness is the treatment of slaves anywhere was a threat to slavery and white privilege lifestyle everywhere. The slave codes reinforced the public policy, giving it substance and statutory authority. In the South, the policy gave rise to a unique racial code of etiquette that prescribed the status, role, and expected behavior for both blacks and whites. The new racial etiquette gave respectability to the policy. Laws were enacted that required newspapers, businesses, and social organizations to be ever mindful of the policy and to publicize the code of etiquette. Often, clergymen were required to read both of them to their congregations. Man, so they was reading these policies and laws in the churches when they congregated. That's crazy. The primary purpose of the of etiquette was to support the public policy on the use of blacks by requiring that all whites act superior to blacks at all times and that blacks give uh, deference to whites and act inferior to them at all times. The secondary purpose of the code and public policy was to make it possible for whites to exercise effective control over blacks to strengthen the sense of white unity. In the year 1787, the drafters of the United States Constitution incorporated the colonial public policy on blacks into the founding documents of the new nation, making it the slaveholders' friend by recognizing and legitimizing black enslavement. The concept of blacks as property and the doctrine of non-interference appear as three interconnected clauses in the Constitution, which of course served as the legal basis of the nation. The Constitution declared blacks to be three-fifths of a person, prohibited Congress from outlawing the slave trade for 20 years, and bound the states to assist in returning fugitive slaves to their masters. The drafters made it clear that the government was the legal instrument of white society and that it should be powerless to interfere with black enslavement within the states or with foreign slave trading practices. Yet, on the other hand, it was also mandated to exercise its full power to protect the white slaveholders' investments in slave properties. Until the Revolutionary War, the public policy on the use of black labor evolved primarily from the tobacco growing regions supported by commercial interests. The profitability of slavery declined until Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in the year 1793. In the midst of Europe's Industrial Revolution, the cotton gin increased the popularity of cotton and black slavery. At the time, wool was the primary fabric because cotton was scarce and generally very expensive. The cotton gin made American produced cotton the king of agricultural products and the primary fabric of the world. This surge in cotton's popularity reshackled blacks to America's plantations. Businesses and industries associated with and dependent upon black slavery sprang up throughout the North and South. The renewed economic dependence on black labor demanded support from the public and private sectors. White society became more dependent than ever on black labor for creating wealth and income. Moreover, it became it became more determined to keep blacks subordinate, unskilled, non-competitive, and excluded from white society. The next section. The Civil War modified the public policy. By the mid 1800s, the North insisted on change in the public policy on black labor because Northern workers could not compete with the uncompensated slave labor of the South. The South refused and the nation went to war. The national public policy was in limbo from immediately after the Civil War until the late 1890s. During this time period, the South had no official labor force or public policy on the use of blacks. Emancipation legally said blacks were no longer personal property. Newly freed slaves sought to break free of the old public policy. They demanded the 40 acres and a mule that they had been promised as compensation for their years of unpaid labor. Blacks wanted to leave slavery prepared to be self sufficient and productive. However, to break free of the old national public policy would require the government to give millions of blacks unused public lands or portions of old southern plantations for homesteading. For the newly freed slaves to be competitive, they needed quality school systems to help them shake off centuries of forced ignorance and to protect them from the animosities of their old enslavers and enemies. The newly freed slaves needed legal and police protection since they were never permitted to bear arms. However, however, blacks received none of these things because the national public policy on blacks as a labor force was unchanged by the Civil War. Both the North and the South had needs for a low paid, intellectually non competitive labor force. In reconciling post war differences, the North adopted the public policy of its Southern brothers on the treatment of blacks. There was never any serious effort to give blacks any measures of economic independence or to compensate them for their generations of unpaid labor. As a Washington, D.C. newspaper noted in the year 1868, quote, it is impossible to separate the question of color from the question of labor, for the reason that the majority of the laborers throughout the southern states are colored people, and nearly all of the colored people are at present laborers. End quote. To change black status as laborers would cause changes in society's political and social ordering of acceptability. Thus, the North and the South collectively agreed to continue but modify the basic tenets undergirding the public policy on blacks. The black freedmen were penniless, uneducated, homeless, and friendless in a hostile South. Without land reparations or tools, they had little choice except to offer the market their only resource, themselves. As an available, trained, cheap labor force, blacks stepped into a predictable future. The Southern states enacted the Black Codes, which revised the national public policy on blacks, forcing them to sharecropping on Southern farms under the control of former slaveholders. The Black Codes effectively modified the public policy by substituting sharecropping for slavery. It also fixed black people in a subordinate place in the social order and provided white society with a manageable and inexpensive labor force. The principle behind the national public policy remained intact and survives to this day.
All right, we go into the public policy during the civil rights era. The latest great change in the national public policy came in the early 1960s and coincided with the civil rights movement, which championed the awakening of Black America during what became known as the Decade of Progress between 1955 and 1965. Blacks won the battle to attend white schools, sit at white lunchroom counters, and sit in the bus seats that had historically been reserved for whites only. Little notice was given amidst the celebrating to the fact that the income gap between blacks and whites was widening. The two societies were growing more segregated than ever. Blacks were losing their few businesses and disposable income to white suburban stores, and black unemployment was beginning to skyrocket. The integration accomplishment, and let me get the diagram up here real quick. The integration accomplishments of blacks had coincided with new phases of the public policy on blacks. Obsolence. First, for the first time in history of the nation, blacks were free from white society's prescribed labor roles. Major advances in technology became the magic bullet that freed the larger white society from the dependence on black labor. The two groups' newfound freedoms caused major adjustments in black white relations. White societies shifted away from the dependence on black labor, was noted by Alvin Toffler in his book, Power Shift. Toffler asserted the most important economic development of this lifetime was the use of a new system of creating wealth based no longer on muscle, but mind. Whites began moving towards a colorblind society where new labor saving machines replaced the need for black muscle and sweat. Machines were less offensive and threatening. It was less likely that new labor saving machines would champion equality, integration, or civil rights. Instead, new technology provided a bridge from the old world to the new world and freed the dominant white society from its old ways of thinking about race relations, its old ideologies, and its public policies. The new technology pushed white society into a public policy for blacks. Few unskilled jobs were left in the white businesses and industries. Simultaneously, conservatives and liberal white politicians alike claimed that the civil rights movement had succeeded in giving blacks their social and legal rights. There was nothing else anyone could do for blacks. Blacks were, therefore, finally free but obsolete. And our next section, implementing the public policy. Implementing the public policy. Eight major factors appear to have driven the public policy on the use and treatment of blacks across the centuries. Number one, the European colonies were predisposed by their native culture to have negative feelings about blackness and black people. Two, they established a public edict that was based around a common need that, if resolved, would be beneficial to all members of white society. Three, white society refined and vigorously supported a coherent public policy on blacks that was transmitted from generation to generation through laws and social customs. Four, the policy was codified by official government acts. Five, it was concertedly supported by all levels of government, schools, churches, businesses, and the larger general society. Six, a sense of community accountability for supporting the public policy was established. Seven, the public policy received total commitment from all segments of the community. Eight, the public policy was continuously promoted and coordinated by institutions and other entities. As a result of these factors, a consensus was reached on how blacks were to be treated. The public policy was expanded and modified incrementally. The adjustment continued over the centuries based upon the broad labor needs of white society. The nature and the modification can be tracked to some extent by the historical development of the nation. When new opportunities and challenges demanded human labor in the agricultural fields of the South, the range lands of the West, the factories of the North, or the military battlefronts all around the globe, the appropriate government or white institutions made sure that black labor force was available and in the front line. In the forefront.
Next section, role of societal institutions. All of the societal institutions supported the established public policy for the use of blacks, the churches, schools, businesses, and government joined in the alliance against blacks. They were parts of a larger social network that systematically concentrated power, wealth, authority, and resources in the hands of white society and co-signed blacks to a subordinate and exploited status. The church offered biblical justification for black enslavement, denouncing blacks as heathens and bearing the mark of Ham. They preached the doctrines of white superiority and black inferiority and excluded blacks from a segregated them uh and excluded blacks from or segregated them within the congregations. Within the churches founded by blacks, ministers internalized their conditions, taught blacks meekness and resignation, and a nonviolent strategy for gaining access to their rights and white owned and white controlled resources. Educational institutions carried out their essential purpose of servicing economic ends of white society. They prepared white children to be the leaders and masters of their own fate. White youths were taught academic skills, cultural values, and the pragmatic responsibilities of leadership. The schools passed on the doctrines of white superiority and black inferiority to both races. Black children suffered centuries of planned ignorance. During slavery, it was illegal to teach blacks to read. Today, they attend inferior, ill equipped schools. American businesses played a role in tailoring the national policy on blacks to their wealth building interests. They formulated new economic principles of capitalism that defined blacks as human commodities and their labor as cheap tools to produce great wealth. American government functioned as a guardian of white wealth and power. White society used government power to enhance or maintain their own privileged positions and to reduce the social and economic status and potential of blacks. Government guaranteed white control over the fruits of black labor and control over the work process. Government later sustained the inequities of perpetuating the myth of equal opportunity. Once the public policy for blacks was established, all members of the alliance were committed to vigorously supporting it, whatever the cost. A sense of commitment to the policy was a part of the broad sense of white community cohesiveness. Attacks on or violations of the policy anywhere were an offense against the policy everywhere. The South was so committed that its members preferred to secede from the Union and engage in a civil war before altering the policy. Next section: psychological and social conditioning process. The national public policy on blacks was structured to incorporate the psychological and social conditioning process for blacks and whites that evolved over the course of American history. Slaveholders' absolute power over blacks allowed them to operate an efficient and effective slave conditioning system. Slaveholders constructed internal controls on slaves that minimized the external force necessary to control them. The government provided the environment for the legal for the legal framework that um, allowed the conditioning process to exist and to operate for 250 years. The slaveholders continued, excuse me, the slaveholders conditioned blacks to serve as good slaves. The effects carried over into the freed black society and affected the general behavior of blacks as a race of people. Table 10 indicates some of the major goals, techniques, and strategies employed in the conditioning process that forged a helpless, submissive, manageable labor force. The process was designed to to instill in blacks strict discipline and a sense of inferiority, belief in the slave owner's superior power, acceptance of the owner's standards, and a deep sense of a slave's helplessness and dependence. That's why Reggie's always talking about, always saying, I don't buy into that. That's big time because that's the first step. It's not buying into that. But we see where it comes from here by reading this. Let me continue. The slave owners strove to cut blacks off from their own history, culture, language, and community, and to uh, inculcate white society value system. That blacks are still burdened by the legacies of such conditioning speaks to its effectiveness. Though some slaves resisted the system, worked because the majority of slaves gave passive approval and cooperation to the slaveholder. That in turn made slavery more profitable and permanent. Had slaves been determined not to cooperate and to sabotage production, regardless of the cost to themselves and their families, they undoubtedly would have changed the course of history and perhaps spared their descendants centuries of suffering.
Meritorious manumissions. Meritorious manumissions was the legal act of freeing a slave for good deeds as defined by the national public policy. Meritorious manumission could be granted to a slave who distinguished himself by saving the life of the white master, inventing a new medicine, or snitching on fellow slaves. This was a destructive weapon in the slave holder's arsenal and a powerful component of the public policy. The importance that whites placed on black informants is emphatically demonstrated by a rare monument that at the town of Harper's Ferry erected in the honor of Hayward Shepherds, a black man who was killed by the totally committed abolitionist John Brown and his raiding party shortly before the beginning of the Civil War. Hayward Shepherd was shot dead by John Brown's party when he recognized John Brown and attempted to warn the town that they were there to free the slaves. In grateful recognition for placing the economic interests of the slaveholders above the freedom of his own people. God. The town erected the only monument honoring a black man who could appropriately be described as a Sambo. Since the Black Civil Rights Movement of the late 1960s, the statue has been stored beside the city's major museum and covered with a wooden box. Meritorious manumission was not only used as an instrument to reward blacks, but it was a device for destroying black unity and race loyalty. It created a very effective informant system. The meritorious manumission policy introduced a strong element of distrust among the slaves and made it more difficult for slaves to organize a revolt. The psychological techniques used were designed to drive wedges between slaves and to train them to trust no one other than the white slave master. Meritorious manumission was the first instituted was first instituted in Virginia in 1710. According to Peter M. Bergman, The Chronicle History of the Negro in America, the technique of meritorious manumissions was adopted by all of the colonies. And this quote, the first use in Virginia of the legislative power to break the bonds of the slaves was made in this year, 1710. A Negro named Will was cited for discouraging a slave conspiracy in the colony, and in recognition and reward for the public service, an act was passed conferring freedom upon him. This act of freedom read, the said Negro will is and shall be forever hereafter free from slavery, and shall enjoy and have all the liberties, privileges, and immunities of are to a free Negro belonging. End of the quote. The Act of Freedom restored some of the liberties, privileges, and immunities that Maryland's public edicts took from blacks in 1638. This national discipline policy was so successful that in more than 250 years of slavery, there was not one successful slave revolt in North America. Of the mere 150 to 200 attempted slave insurrections, in nearly every instance, the slave revolts were permanently exposed. Unfortunately, the informant in nearly every instance was a black person. Man. Keeping blacks in a minority status, white society has always placed a great deal on the importance of maintaining power and control through numerical dominance. Since the public policy stressed keeping blacks in a controlled subordinate state, the national immigration laws, beginning with the first one in 1790, were used as control tools. Immigration policies and laws kept the black population below the white comfort level, usually less than 8%. During the 20 years preceding the Revolutionary War, the colonial settlers were extremely fearful of the uncontrolled number of black slaves being shipped into the country. By 1750, the percentage of the total national population that was black had reached nearly a third. Black slave revolts were on the increase, and British military officers encouraged slaves to rise up against the slave owners. Ironically, none did. Though they had good opportunities during the Revolutionary War, in 1790, white society's fear of reprisal from blacks prompted the first Congress to enact a law that mandated taking a population census and publishing the results every 10 years. Census data monitors social, economic, and political changes according to race and provided the government with the database for designing public policies. Reason for the damn census. Table 10 outlines, let me get table 10 up here. Oh wait, table 11, sorry about that. Table 11 outlines the legal names that were used by whites during the past 200 years to skillfully manipulate social circumstances to maintain the population status quo between them and blacks. The increase in the black population in the 1700s was counteracted by the enactment of the first immigration laws in 1790, which sought European whites to reduce the total black population that range to a range that made whites comfortable between 5 and 8%. Though blacks had a birth rate that doubled that of whites, U.S. immigration laws annually brought in so many non-black immigrants that the nation's black population was reduced from 33% in the late 1700s to less than 10% at the beginning of the 1900s. Strict anti-black immigration laws assured the majority white society that blacks would remain a numerical as well as a psychological minority. Though immigration policies at the turn of the 20th century contained language that could have set a black immigration quota of 1%, for all practical purposes, until the late 1960s, immigration was closed to blacks. As indicated in Table 11, whites consistently use a variety of means to keep the black population below 8%. Immigration policies were the major device for keeping both black percentages under control, especially after the successful Haitian revolt following 1790. Immigration policies and the massive influx of illegal non-black immigrants drove the black population into the low teens. Get that back up. Sorry about that. There never have been and never will be a black refugee program, no matter how desperate or life threatening the circumstances are that they are fleeing. The nation's total black population has climbed to 12.4%, which is above whites' 8% comfort range and dangerously close to their take action 15% tipping point. If history is any indicator, the major society will initiate measures to reduce or increase their control over America's black population at their whim. Ironically, Black Africa constitutes 12.4% of world population. In order to develop a plan for self-empowerment, complete with goals and policies, Blacks must understand the public policy models and doctrines that were used against them in order to empower white society. The model used by white America was very successful. Just as whites have done, Blacks must now unashamedly protect their self-interest, pursue real power and wealth, and shape themselves into a politically and economically competitive group in America.
Shout out to Ice Cube.
Yes, yes. The greatest challenge to Black America is to do what Blacks have never been permitted to do in the past. Through centuries of slave insurrections, civil rights demonstrations, and urban riots, Blacks have never had a public policy or clearly identifiable goals. Like you said, Ice Cube, they have not developed a public policy on how they are going to deal with racism, where they intend to go as a people, or how best to get there. This public policy ought to be broadly disseminated to all Blacks and interlinked with all levels of Black communities across America. All segments, churches, schools, businesses, and community organizations should be involved in designing strategies and supporting the public policy. Rather than reinventing the wheel, Blacks should use white society models for establishing public policies because it was very successful.
In conclusion, Black Americans have always been a compassionate and caring people. They should continue to do so. But it is now time for them to put their own interests first if they are to have any chance of changing their negative living conditions. Black America must develop strategies and programs that serve their best interests and allow them to both develop and protect themselves within a society that historically committed harmful acts against them. Until Black obsolescence was reached about 20 years ago, Blacks had limited ability to organize because they lacked capital, leadership, and resources, and they were restrained by an economic system that still had a use for them. Now that Black labor is non-essential and expendable, Blacks as a group are vulnerable and expendable. A national plan for Black empowerment should focus on Blacks becoming politically and economically competitive by acquiring increased wealth and resource power. The greatest challenge to Black America is to do what it has never done before. Through the centuries of slavery, Jim Crowism, the civil rights movement, and the Black Power period, Blacks have never had a public policy or racial goals to effectively deal with racism. Instead of an empowerment plan, new generations of Blacks have inherited the vestiges of a failed 1960s strategy. Three major failings deserve highlighting. First, Black leadership mistakenly believed that by removing Jim Crow symbols, that racism would effectively die, right? So pulling down those statues and people get all happy. Second, they thought integration would make them equal and give them control of resources and power. Let me sit in the front of the bus. Third, they failed to construct long-term institutions and long-term goals that can transcend generational lines and produce a never-ending flow of competent, well-informed new talent. Young Blacks must have a public policy and a plan for direction. All segments of the community, churches, schools, businesses, community organizations must be involved in formulating and implementing the plan. But the plan must be coordinated nationally by an institute with an intellectual infrastructure. Modeling the methods used by whites, Blacks must develop an accountability system to make sure that all Blacks support the goals of the plan. Blacks will have to be equally as determined and committed to public policy on Black self-empowerment as white society has been to public policy on the use of Blacks. Blacks must be willingly to apply social sanctions and other penalties against those who violate the public policy for Blacks. The Black Empowerment Plan must be based upon a vision of vigorously competing in a changing world. The plan must go beyond the dream of equality and integration, which hangs before them like a carrot on a stick. And that concludes Chapter 7 of Black Labor, White Wealth, The Search for Power and Economic Justice by the author, Dr. Claude Anderson.
Yes, indeed. Another great chapter. Another great chapter. Damn, this man, Dr. Claude got some great work, man. I've been enjoying the heck out of these books. You got to give me that. You got to send me that list of the other books you got because I got to add those on there as well.
Okay. Yeah, I got. I think I got two more of his books. They're called like Dirty Little Secrets, and then the other one is called More Dirty Little Secrets, where he just lays out how they were able to do the things that he describes in this book, Black Labor, White Wealth, and also in the Powernomics book. But I'm gonna send them to you so you can check those out, man. Those are brilliant tools also.
Right on, because I got my order. I got to put my order in, get them shipped here quick.
Yes, sir.
But yeah, another great read, man. Any final words? And then we'll be back in here tomorrow for what should we do the same time? Chapter 8 looks.
Yeah, these ones come out
a little bit earlier.
Yeah, we can do around the same time, or 7 o'clock. 7 or 7:30 is fine because only really chapter 6 was as long as it was. These last 3 chapters are pretty bang bang bang. Shout out to John Witherspoon. But yeah, I want to say thank you to everybody in the chat for listening with us and rocking with us. Everybody that's listening on the replay for rocking with us. We appreciate that. We see y'all commenting in the chat as we go live.
Salute to my brother Reggie Owens, and everybody else. Salute to Dr. Claude Anderson for putting the work together. And as y'all listening to this, even if y'all in the chat live, if y'all ever get a chance to and you busy and you don't got nothing else to do, listen to the replay, man, because there's a lot of gems. I go over these books more than once, and I still catch stuff that I didn't catch the first couple times, or I get a better understanding of them as I research some of the terms and words and acts and provisions in the books that are being laid out. For example, um, that's how I learned about the. If people talk to me in person or you know what I'm saying offline, I often refer to the manumissions. The manumissions, the Notorious Manumissions Act, as being the catalyst of what today is known as snitching and how it's used. And had I not read this book and listened to a lot of Dr. Claude Anderson lectures that you can also find on YouTube, I wouldn't know these things. So I encourage everybody to not only listen, but study some of the stuff we're talking about. Because it's one thing to read, it's another thing to listen, and it's a whole another thing to study. So I just say study to show yourselves approved, so that we can all be on top of this stuff and we can apply it when we can apply it in our personal lives and business ventures. And so we can create small networks that will turn into big networks. And so we can make these changes that can help not only ourselves, our family, but actually our people on a national level, because that's what we always talk about. And we always say who has a plan, who's going to lead, where's the ideas, but we don't ever want to go into these books where the information is there that have the plans, that people like Dr. Claude Anderson already did the research from the perspective of American history and our conditions specifically that addressed our specific conditions. And so therefore, when people like Ice Cube gets together with people like Derek Hamilton, who's a black economist, and he lays out the contract for Black America, people have no idea what he's talking about. They just looking at him like he's an actor, rapper, but they have no idea who Derek Hamilton is. They have no idea that Ice Cube used Powernomics as the basis and foundation of the contract with Black America. They have no idea that he spoke with financial doctors and professors like Boyce Watkins, and so it's easily for people to dismiss not only Ice Cube but the contract for Black America, because we have not taken the time to be diligent in our own research and know that what he's talking about is basically an accumulation of the research that he's done. So when we do the research, we can understand what he's saying perfectly fine. We can understand the language in the contract with Black America perfectly fine, and we'll understand how to utilize that and leverage that wherever we are in the states when we go to these voting booths or go to our local town hall meetings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you know what I'm saying? I'm gonna be long-winded, man. My bad. Um, just
Help me,
come
you
back,
cooking, man.
come back.
Keep going, bro.
Y'all always come back. Subscribe to Reggie Owens. Subscribe to Tank Obadiah TV. Subscribe to the Sweet Science Examiner for boxing content. We try to always speak intelligently. We try to always be uplifting towards our people and everyone else who is uplifting towards us. You know, my whole thing is I like to reciprocate the energy that's that's given, and I expect that back. If you're not giving it back, then I don't got no time for you. So you know what I mean. We need to all have a similar attitude towards this, and get to the point to where we're always trying to elevate and evolve ourselves from an intellectual standpoint. And you know, where it begins is the research and reading. So that's the plan, is to make reading cool and to make reading great and to make reading something that our young people want to do, and not as a punishment, but it's something that, they want to get to the next book. They want to get the next piece of information. They want to get the next piece of the puzzle, so that we can all elevate from generation to generation to generation. And with that being said, You know what I'm saying? I salute all y'all. I love all my peoples, all you kings and queens that rock with us every day, all you kings and queens that's listening to us on the replays. You know what I'm saying? Peace and blessings to all y'all.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, man. Perfectly stated, man. I can't add nothing on top of that, man. But that's all we got. We got about 25 minutes, 24 minutes for the barbershop. Give us some time to debrief on that one, soak all the information coming in from this chapter, and see you guys over on the barbershop. But that was a great close. Tank, I ain't got nothing to add on that, bro.
Yes, sir. See y'all in the barbershop.